Welcome everybody to the New Lyre podcast. My name is David Gosselin and I'm the editor for New Lyre. And I have here returning once again our very lovely and interesting guest, Adam Cedia, who is a poet, lawyer based out of Indiana, essayist, and contributor to New Lyre, as well as our other poetry website, the Chained Muse. And both are dedicated to the promotion of timeless art and investigating what it means to create timeless art. What does it mean to create a classic, right? What defines the classics of the past, but also what defines a classic universally in any time? How do we create new classics? So we're back to explore this question, and I want to welcome you, Adam Cedia. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me again. I very much enjoy this. And before we get started, I just want to share with you, I ended up getting Chinese takeout last night. And in my fortune cookie, I got this little message here. You have the ability to sense and know higher truth. So I hope that ends up being fortuitous.
Let's find out. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to talk about, and we have some recurring themes, things that we've already discussed in previous podcasts. But I think this question of the counterculture is very important today, and we really can't say enough about it. We can't investigate that issue enough because it's so pervasive. Today in society, there are certain axioms, certain ideas of human nature, which go beyond just the level of rational sort of thinking, and sort of touch on a higher conception of what is the nature of the universe that people are operating in. And the reason we're so interested in poetry and the reason we love poetry is that poetry really, at its fundamental base, is an investigation of the nature of the universe. Different poets present different ideas of the universe, and they are investigating that using irony and metaphor, and they're presenting us with an idea which is immaterial, right? Ideas have no breadth, depth, length. They're immaterial. And I think in modern times, this has created a real crisis for people because we are dominated with a sort of empiricist mindset, which really comes out of the Enlightenment, or especially has been shaped by the Enlightenment, where really objective truth is a question of what you can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell. If you can't touch, taste, hear, see, or smell it, you can't really define. It's not objective. It belongs to the obscure department of metaphysics. But the problem is, and I think this is what we're going to be talking about for most of the podcast as well, is that what happens if you're in an ugly society? What happens if you're in a degenerate society, a dying civilization, right? If the purpose of the artist is simply to impart their emotions and impressions and sort of reflect that society, to the degree that their society is ugly, their art will be ugly. Or if people don't like that idea of ugly, even to start, to the degree that their society is corrupt or dying, their art is just going to be a reflection of this decay, of this corruption. And I think this is the crucial question. How are we to find and investigate a higher truth, which goes beyond what people can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell, which is in a sense more objective, even if its characteristics are not directly perceivable. And that's the point, is that ideas may not be directly perceivable, but just because something is not directly perceivable and doesn't have directly perceivable characteristics, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have indirectly perceivable characteristics. Doesn't mean there aren't certain axioms, certain assumptions about the nature of the universe. And this is what we're investigating when we're looking at a piece of great art. And so Dante is a perfect example. I used this in the last podcast, but I'd say if had Dante been a pure modernist, he would have never written purgatory or paradise, or maybe he'd have just written the Inferno and purgatory. But had he been a modernist, there would be no paradise, because the world he lived in was really hell. It really was an inferno. It really was a degenerate and corrupt society that ultimately destroyed itself. And it was a new society was reborn with the Renaissance, but this was based on a fundamentally different conception of human nature. So yeah, I think that's,
I don't think he would have written any of the three, because Inferno presumes a paradise. Inferno is Inferno because there is a paradise. What modernism would have done is just mishmash all three together and present us with a series of what is seen without any associated value judgment for it. Inferno could be paradise, just as in paradise could be the Inferno if the observer sees it that way, if the observer has values, so to speak. I'll call them values. So I think we would have the three dimensions, but we wouldn't have what they are or what they represent. We would just have the souls blowing in the wind, or or wallowing in the fecal matter or whatever, and no value judgment, and they're in Inferno because of what the souls did measured against what the eternal laws of the universe are. Modernism, it either denies or says we don't know about these eternal laws, so these souls are just there, and who knows, they might like it. It's up to each individual. That's how modernism would treat the world Dante saw. And if I can back up a little bit, the power, well, the duty of poetry and where it derives its power, takes those ideals and it puts them into terms we can taste, touch, hear, see, and smell.
right.
That's what metaphor is. That it's the transfer from the eternal into the immediate, and the putting of those ideas into terms familiar to us is what makes poetry so powerful.
Right. I mean, wow. Well, that's a very profound point that you're making there. And I mean, what you just said makes me think, because okay, there is no Inferno either. I mean, that's interesting. Or in the sense that, yeah, you said that even the concept of the Inferno in Dante's comedy implies a paradise, but in a modernist conception, there would be none of the above, right? Things just are. And I mean, that's the question, for the souls in the Inferno, for any of us who've ever felt that we are treading an inferno and being, hit with fecal matter and, fire rains and all that. The question is, how did we get in the Inferno, right? Dante opens his comedy with, in the midst of our life's way, I found myself within a darkened forest, right? It opens in medias res, as they say, right? It's
Exactly.
in middle of action. We're thrust into this moment, and there's really a whole process of figuring out, well, how did we get here, and how do we get out? And there are certain fundamental leaps, in conceptual leaps, that Dante has to make in order to cross from the Inferno into purgatory into paradise. But I mean, this idea that there is none of the above,
and Dante has a guide too. He
right?
to this world and say, okay, have at it. No, he's given a guide from the past, who very intentionally is another great poet.
Virgil. Yes. Wow. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, and as a in counterpoint to that, I mean, this idea of Huxley's Brave New World, I mean, I can't sort of emphasize this enough in terms of there are some very profound epistemological points made in the Brave New World, regardless of really what side Huxley was taking on the question, where there's this scene where one of the main characters is presented with the choice between happiness or high art. And it's either you have happiness, quote unquote happiness in the Brave New World, or you have high art, which is Shakespeare, right? Which is Dante. And specifically in Brave New World, there's a discussion of Shakespeare. And the character is asking, well, why can't we have Shakespeare? Why can't we read this beautiful language? Why can't we explore and appreciate these beautiful concepts found in Shakespeare? And the character gets the answer that it's because in real life, it's because in Shakespeare, there is tragedy, right? And you can't have tragedy if you're quote unquote happy, if you want to live in a quote unquote happy world. But there's the rub, that there's no tragedy, but there's no goodness, there's no bad, there's no anything. It's just a blah sort of existential, unchanging, static state of contentedness, right? Which of course is only made possible because there's an abundance of drugs, there's an abundance of synthetic music, right? There's an abundance of promiscuity.
Yeah.
And so there are distractions, right? And that's the essential point. But in Shakespeare, yeah, there is tragedy, but there's tragedy because people actually have to make choices. And there's actually something called the universe, which has an ordering. It has a lawfulness. And to the degree that the characters are not able to recognize the tragedy and fallacy of their own axioms, they destroy themselves. But not only they, right? Civilization destroys itself. And so the characters are really only a microcosm of this drama unfolding. And it's really, it's the question of being able to see these characters not in terms of this some sort of melodrama, which is what most modern art, most popular art is reduced to, where it's just these individuals and they have their individual problems, and it's a whole struggle, whether it's a hillbilly elegy or which I recently watched, or it's whatever, whether it's The Purge or whether it's any of these
Game of Thrones,
right? It's all intrigue and da-da-da. But in Shakespeare, there's a higher system. And the tragedy has to do with characters not being being blinded by their axioms, not being able to change their axioms, and therefore failing to discover this higher lawfulness, which if they continue to violate it, right, their kingdoms will crumble. Their civilization will rot as it was rotten, as things rotted in the state of Denmark.
Well, and that's an interesting issue because now you're transposing the modernist versus classical outlook into a political realm. We have, in the melodrama, it's all a question of power and who at the end of the day wins, regardless. There's no question of, is the power exercised according to correct principle or universal truth?
Right.
And instead we get this, Nietzschean might makes right world. Whereas, in the classical outlook in Shakespeare, we have the question of, is this in accordance with truth? And you can even carry this over into, Confucian philosophy and the mandate of heaven. The exercise of power must be in accordance with principles of truth, or it is illegitimate and can and should and will be overthrown.
Right. And I mean, Confucianism is really, it's so important. Number one, I mean, this has really shaped a good part of civilization, if only because, Confucianism has sort of shaped the development of China for much of history, for much of its history. But also, Confucius had this very, I think, very profound, and I mean, I think this is so relevant in the context of political correctness and a lot of the cultural paradigm that we're in, where he had the rectification of terms. And he made the point that to the degree that words are used in their proper sense, with their proper meaning, right, society will be, the affairs of society will be ordered. To the degree that terms are not used in their proper sense and do not signify the appropriate ideas, there will be confusion in society, and society will ultimately suffer. And if it goes on for too long, it will ultimately collapse.
And that is one of my favorite philosophic principles, and you see it in play today. I mean, with something as basic as pronouns. When we don't have correctness in terminology, we don't have correctness in thought, and when we don't have correctness in thought, we don't have order, and without order, society collapses. I mean, you could say this is really the first real linguistic approach to philosophy. Go ahead. No, and I was just going to say, and what we have now is a concerted effort to blur and confuse and in academic parlance, problematize words, and that there is an objective to the objective is explicitly to tear down existing power structures. Well, that's effectively tearing down trying to tear down the universe of meaning that we live by.
Right.
And it denies objective truth at its core.
Right. And I mean, regardless of where people are on the political spectrum, or I mean, their ideological background, I mean, this question of perversion of language, right? A usurping of language in order to advance certain ideological goals, certain agendas. I mean, this is a historical fact. This has happened throughout history. It's nothing new. We see it today, I think, in a way that's very alarming, where there's a complete lack of nuance. And I mean, this is where poetry and art really plays a fundamental role. But today the problem is that there's really a lack of nuance in the public discourse, where people are judged not really on their deeds, not really on what they do per se, but they're judged on how they're using language. Are they using words in the correct way, in the prescribed way or proscribed way? And there's sort of there's a sort of detachment from objective reality, in a sense that, words are just given these meanings that are ultimately just used to advance a certain cause. And I mean, we don't even need to, I mean, for the sake of this podcast, discuss whether XYZ such and such cause is legitimate or not. But to say that unless you're able to investigate the nuance in an idea, just because somebody says, I mean, the Black Lives Matter thing is obviously a big deal. And, then somebody's going to say, well, all lives matter, right? And of course, if you say all lives matter, that's implying, it's not just implying that you're saying all human life is worthy, right? But the understanding within our current cultural matrix is that, no, if you say all lives matter, you're saying
you're denying that Black Lives Matter.
You're expressing opposition to the idea of Black Lives Matter, which is the idea, right, which is, it's basically, rejecting, let's say it's rejecting racism. So if Black Lives Matter is supposed to be promoting a civil rights cause, if you were opposing or challenging that concept, it's just the idea is you're opposing civil rights, right? And I mean, I think that's just one good example of how things get so polarized. And the reality is that the reality is everything in between. The reality is everything between all those terms. And poetry, high art, is really developing our creative faculties, right? This idea of metaphor, such that we're actually able to get in there and sort of really investigate, well, what is the nature of human beings? What is the nature of the universe that we're in? Regardless of your social justice cause or your political cause or your, ideological cause, are the ideas that we're discussing framed within the context of a rational universe, or a universe that a legitimate conception of the universe? And I think this is what people often, this is what sort of goes, people don't even consider, well, what universe are we in? Whatever we're talking about, what universe are we in? That's really going to decide the validity and power of our concepts, right? Over an idea of persuasion, popular opinion, and just sort of being able to implement one's ideas in a sense by force, whether it's through just, through popular culture, right? By enforcing certain assumptions or ideas through cinema and art and whatnot. But, unless there's a higher conception of the universe, and that we're having a debate about what universe we're in, these arguments over words and terms and judging people based on the correct, prescribed use of language becomes completely crazy. And I would just close by saying, I mean, if you do that, you'll never understand poetry. You'll never understand nuance. And poetry is all nuance. Poetry is everything in between an assumed meaning and the reality. So unless people can get beyond their own assumptions and get into a state where they can investigate and make an inventory of their assumptions, what do I believe this word means? What universe am I assuming is implied by my formulation? Unless we're discussing that and saying what is the objective universe being described, judging people for the words they use is, I mean, it just lacks poetry, quite frankly.
Well, I mean, you have to, it's not simply a question of, is there a universal or a view of the universe backing this up? Is that view in accord with the truth? Use of words, back to the Confucius saying, the words have meaning, and if the meaning is not in accord with the truth, the word has no meaning, and confusion results. And that's why I think, in this fight over language and attempts to redefine terms, there's a, if you notice the people that push this, and at all times in history have pushed this sort of thought, there's a deep rage there. And I think the rage comes from a realization of the lie, that these words are not in accordance with the truth. And again, and that goes, taking this even further, that presumes all of us inherently know what the truth is. That's part of our human nature. And that's why modernism is really aberrant, because every society, there's that recognition that all of us know truth. That's why we have law. That's why we have the idea of right and wrong and crime. And when you ignore or cast doubt upon even the existence of truth, everything else falls apart. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think this is a first a good approximation of a definition of a classic. It's a work of art that actually strives to develop some sort of conception of what is the nature of the universe we're in. What is the true nature of that universe? and looking for a way to sort of capture that within within some sort of material medium, within some form, and within the context of a society that is, of course, always changing. So, right, the great artist is trying to capture something unchanging, some unchanging truth, something eternal about the nature of the universe, the nature of human beings, and is only successful if they're able to guard these eternal truths within the context of an ever-changing world, within sense images, right? Within a metaphoric, and this is the purpose of metaphorical language. We're using images, or we're using words, but we're not using them just for effect, right? We're not using them just to create some sensation in our audience and to sort of entertain our audience for the moment, right? Which is really popular today, but we're just using one instance of some finite experience or a set of finite images and experiences in order to communicate something infinite, something unchanging that transcends just a direct experience of whatever it is the images are, right? Whether it's a love lyric from ancient Greece, right? Which is talking about the Sappho talks about the storm, right, and the raging wild winds uprooting oaks. I mean, which is a very powerful image. But I mean, it's not just the literal wind blowing and uprooting oaks. Actually, it's about Eros. It's an ode or lyric poem addressing the god Eros and sort of describing what it's doing to her. But the imagery is deeply metaphorical, and that's what makes it so powerful. It's that it's saying something that goes beyond the words, and it's making that a conscious object of attention for the audience to experience that and to become conscious of that within themselves, which makes them able to investigate the nature of what it is they're really feeling, right? The higher idea.
And that's why we care about what she wrote about that, 2,500 years ago in another continent, and why it still speaks to us, why Sappho's works still appear in print, and why people why we're even mentioning her name right now. Yeah, and there's you could look at there's another phenomenon, consider works that, for example, in the West were unknown or never part of the canon, Chinese poetry or Sanskrit epics. And when they were discovered, they were adopted and recognized as classics in the West just as much. Or even more extreme, when ancient Egyptian literature that's been unearthed, and now it's commonly read and commonly referenced, when it was forgotten about for 2,000 years. It's that ability to speak to these universals, these eternals, that make that literature
right
been everywhere recognized, that, or even if it's been lost and rediscovered.
Right. And I mean, okay, let me challenge you on this question then, because so I mean, this idea of universals, I think the way that most people, because we're talking about timeless art, so there's no way around this question of universals. And regardless of where people stand, on the question, the point is an investigation of what is the meaning of a universal, right? What is the nature of what we're talking about as the concept of a universal? I mean, you can't get around this. This is I mean, you can find this throughout philosophy and history. It's there. So people have to deal with it. And I think the question that a lot of people listening are going to ask even is that, okay, well, I mean, what do you mean by universal, in the sense that is knowledge of universals some sort of prescription, some sort of law that is sort of telling us what we can and can't do, and therefore limiting our ability to express ourselves artistically and emotionally and to communicate ideas and concepts as we experience them? Is it a limitation? Or are we talking about universals as the attempt to understand something which allows us to further develop our power to communicate ideas in a way that is going to endure, right? And beyond our given time and place, right? We want, or and I mean, this is what I think, but I want to hear what you think. But I think the idea is that we want a conception of, the reason I'm interested in the idea of universals and timelessness is that, if I'm writing something, I don't just want it to be written to speak to the, soul, culture, people of this age. I want it to speak to the soul and culture of peoples in any age. So, what do we really mean by universals? Is it a restriction on creativity, on thought, or is it something that's actually going to allow people to further elaborate and fully cultivate their creative faculties?
Well, it's a theme with infinite possibilities of variations. That's, I think it's from Sun Tzu. There are only 5 colors, but the combination of them, there are infinite possible combinations. There are only 12 notes, but there are infinite possible combinations. Your universal truths, are necessarily limiting, because if everything's a truth, nothing is. At the same time, the way in which they manifest themselves and interplay, and affect our lives, in our various stages and times and places, has infinite variations.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think this question of universals is important because you said it's limiting, right? The concepts are limiting in a sense, but they're limiting, I would argue, in the sense that they're limiting us to certain things, but causing us as a result to discover certain ideas and concepts which we couldn't discover had we not discovered or had an understanding of these limitations. And I mean, I think this is a profound idea, but we get into the discussion of ideas where the nature of ideas, the matter of ideas, that the universe is not just organized. The universe is organized by principles, right? And this Johannes Kepler discovered the idea of universal gravitation, but his conception of gravitation as he understood it in the context of the orbits of all the planets was he got to an understanding of what causes all the planets to be at a given point in their orbit at any given time in the orbits of the whole solar system by investigating the nature of the Platonic solids, which are really just an investigation of geometry and harmony. And Kepler discovered that through his investigation of harmony and proportion, not only in the Platonic solids, but as this is expressed in the 12-tone musical scale, that there are certain harmonic principles. So what we see as empty space, as just this, void of space in the universe, space is actually quantized. Space actually has a harmonic ordering, which is discoverable by human reason, right? Through an investigation of what, the Platonic solids just become a sort of shadow of certain harmonic principles that bound any space. And so the point is that Kepler is able to discover the immaterial principles, which are really musical principles, governing the shape of space. And so these are not sense perceptual ideas, but they take a sense perceptual form. And so the sense perceptual manifestation in terms of the ordering of the solar system at any given time is just a reflection of these unchanging principles, these harmonic principles, which are actually governing space. And I would just say that ideas are the same. Ideas.
I seem to remember an essay written about this. The author, it's at the tip of my tongue. I'm saying this tongue in cheek, obviously.
Well, I think ideas have a geometry. Ideas have a shape. And I think if we're really going to get into have an appreciation for what high art is, we need to get a sense that ideas are fundamental causal principles in the universe. They can be discovered, and our sense perception, right, our poetic faculties are really a means of resolving the myriad impressions that we receive, and to sort of bring these into a coherent whole. So science is a special kind of poetry where we're able to resolve the many paradoxes of our experience into some unified conception of the universe. And poets are doing this all the time. That's what poets are really doing. I mean, whether you're looking at Percy Bysshe Shelley, who you wrote a great piece on with your Beyond the Lines analysis of his poem Mont Blanc, right?
Yes.
That Shelley is using the idea of Mont Blanc as this infinite, right? Which is being counterposed to all the myriad different manifestations of time and, earthly happenings. But there's this platonic one which sort of underlies all the chaos that's unfolding below. And it's the ability to unify these two conceptions, these two apprehensions of the world, the finite and the infinite. That's what allows us to actually create new things and to act in the universe in a creative way, because we understand the principles which are shaping what's unfolding before our eyes. And I mean, that's Shakespeare.
And just from the reader's end, I've never been to Switzerland. I've never seen Mont Blanc, but Shelley in his poem conveys the image and conveys the idea behind it such that I can understand it and be affected by it and appreciate it without ever having had his experience.
Right.
Which most people won't, because they will never be with Shelley at that time and place.
Right.
Under those conditions. But poetry is the ability to eternalize that one moment, and it does it by finding an eternal concept for that experience to represent.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, okay, so what's the what's the alternative, right? Okay, let's forget that. Forget everything you just said. Forget everything I just said. Let's just look at the alternative for a second. This is the Brave New World, basically, because there is no good, there is no bad. Sure. Okay. Where are people finding meaning? I mean, they're finding it wherever they can, wherever they want. But ultimately, I mean, I think the tragedy of that idea, if you really want to take it to its, full circle, is that we do end up in a Brave New World. Because if there is no concept of good, if there is no concept of bad, if there is no concept of human beings being able to grapple with and conceive of truths that go beyond what they can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell, then really all you have is what you can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell. And the problem with that is that it gets really boring really fast. And I mean, I think popular art, popular culture is a perfect example of that. And I mean, example number one is The Purge on Amazon Prime, which I've been watching. And for all our audience who isn't familiar with that, The Purge is, there was a series of movies that came out where the purges basically were in this dystopian world where murder is legal for 12 hours, the world is chaos, but the purge is a way for the world to sort of cleanse itself and for all these sort of irrational instincts in human beings to sort of just let loose, go crazy, and sort of just get it out of your system so that after, things can just go back to quote unquote normal, i.e. something stable. And I mean, the reason I think purge clinically is so interesting and a lot of these extreme sort of movies and ideas is that if things are just reduced to what we can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell, it's naturally going to get more, you're going to need new novelty, right? Romanticism is limited, right? You can only talk about singing skylarks in beautiful fields for so long, right? You can only appreciate, the hymns of crickets and, the rustling of bushes for so long. And inevitably, you're going to go to ever more extreme, novel forms of expression and experience because you need to find something new for people, right? You need to find something to get their attention. So naturally, the artist is going to have to keep finding new ways to sort of get people's attention, new ways to sort of shock and surprise people.
Well, here's an interesting thought that popped into my head. That's kind of what did happen with Romanticism as it progressed along towards the end of the 19th century. You had art, taking on a very, very deep interest in the occult. And I talked about that a little bit with Yeats, but it happened in the visual arts too with the symbolists, and that was driven primarily beyond, we've exhausted the experiences we can talk about in the scene, and now we have to move beyond to the unseen realm, and
Right.
that collapsed very quick, and then it degenerated into
Images,
Aleister Crowley and things like that.
right. Satanic rituals, imagism. I mean, it goes. I mean, those two things are different, but yeah, you're forced to look for new things. You're forced to look for new forms of distraction and entertainment. So, I mean, that's the alternative.
And in the world, I wanted to talk about the purge a little bit too. And in the world of the purge, that world is only possible in a world without truth, because while there might not be any in the modernist conception, or however you want to call it, the lack of legal consequences for whatever you do in that 12-hour period is it doesn't explore any discussion of what the moral consequences of what's done then are, and the idea that 12 hours of unbridled criminality would purge society is deeply flawed, because it ignores what a crime is. It's a disruption in the moral order of the universe, and that's why justice demands retribution in some way.
Right.
I'll leave that thought there.
Yeah, I mean, that's one example because I think some people listening may be like, okay, well, you're taking an extreme, right? You're going you're okay. You went from it gets boring to just talk about, singing skylarks and, rustling woods to we have to sort of, we can just murder everybody, decapitate people. And like, you're exaggerating, you know what I mean? Like there's a balance there. I think
that's where it did end up. That's, like I said, sex magic and Aleister Crowley and Satan. That's where it ultimately ended up, was when there's nothing more to explore. You go to the dark recesses to try and dredge stuff up. And you could say the same thing happened with popular music and, the spread of, I don't want to demonstrate my ignorance, but that black metal and very dark themes like that.
right.
That
Okay. And I mean, Yeah, that gets to, I mean, I was just listening to an interview by Alma Deutscher, who is I mean, she's a musical genius. She's really, she's the little girl version of Mozart. And I mean, it's the greatest proof. I mean, I think she's the greatest living proof right now on this planet of what human creativity really means, what it means to be creative. And she sort of is a glaring sort of reality about how ultimately human nature is creative. There is something, I mean, you could say it's divine. There is something higher in human beings, which we're all endowed with to various degrees. And everybody has a potential that can be developed. But the whole idea of developing a potential, if you look at the case of Alma, she had very sort of rigorous training in classical composition and classical principles. And so there is an innate potential in everybody. I think we have to start there, that we're not blank slates, right? When we're talking about universals, if you want a universal, every human being is endowed with a creative capacity, right? Has creative reason. And the goal of society should be to allow individuals to fully develop this. And somebody like Alma Deutscher is just one example of what a society can look like if people really are reaching their full potential. But I mean, we have to have a concept of potential and a concept of creativity where human beings are able to uh, investigate a higher lawfulness and become an expression of this higher creative principle in the universe. And when you don't have that, right, then yeah, you're forced to sort of go in XYZ direction.
Well,
And
and it bears emphasizing that not every human being is going to be an Alma Deutscher or a Mozart or a Keats. You know,
yeah,
your
that's not the
creative,
point.
I mean, your creative potential might be limited to making really good shoes or uh, write, or, you know, being able to write news reports very well or something like that. And it's something that there's not enough emphasis on the craft, whatever your craft is. And you know, that brings up the whole question of, you know, what your place is, and everyone living up to their own unique potential in relation to everyone else. You know, you might call that a version of utopia. But it's possible, and it's something that is already within everyone. It's not something that can be forced upon a society, or a society can't be molded into that. It's more of a question of sweeping aside the impediments to that than it is molding or forcing or shaping a society out of that.
Right. I mean, I think that gets to a conception of Shakespearean tragedy, that the real quality of tragedy is when people are not able to develop their potentialities, their full capacities. And as a result, they live in a society that doesn't sort of recognize or acknowledge that, such that it's left to there's only a small portion of people that really get a chance to develop themselves for whatever reason. I think there's a lot of genius that goes untapped. There's a lot of genius, and I mean, everybody has a quality of genius, but there's a whole spectrum of genius that just doesn't go is never developed because of the way society is organized. And this is what the Brave New World system is, which most people haven't fortunately given into, which is that there is, okay, we don't really have a bearing on the greater outcomes of society. We are not consequential. And so all there is left is really sort of sensual enjoyments, immediate momentary pleasures, and popular art. I mean, this is no small question. What is art? Art is everything that you're doing when you're not just, doing a so-called, assigned task, or, doing something that you feel you have to do out of necessity. Everything else is really the realm of the arts. And the question is, what are we being exposed to during that time? And is it just something that's meant to distract us from the reality that we're living in? Or is it something that's meant to inform and inspire our higher faculties such that we're able to become conscious actors within the reality, on the stage of the real world, and to sort of act on it? And
Well,
to,
I would say it's the job of art to show us the reality, to remind us what the reality is.
right,
Because everything we do fits into this big picture. And, what art does is show us this is how your actions, your emotions, your experiences, whatever, everything in your life makes sense in this world of universal truths. And that's why that's what its place is, and that's why it figures in every culture, because ultimately we have to have meaning.
right, right. And I mean, yeah, otherwise you get a Brave New World where there is just sort of, I mean, I feel like given the times we're in, there's no limit to the amount of times that we can revisit this theme, because it's exactly that, okay, so there's no tragedy, right? In Shakespeare, there's tragedy. There are consequences, right? And there are axioms which people are aware of or not aware of. And these really are shaping what's unfolding on the stage of history per se. So, I mean, if you let that go, and sure, okay, there's no tragedy, right? We don't have an untapped potential, or we don't have a potential. We're just in this, homogenous system of popular culture and sort of existential reality. Then, you know what I mean? Is it any surprise? And I think is it any surprise that most people turn to drugs and turn to entertainment, right? Entertainment as a means of distraction, which has nothing to do with art. It has nothing to do with really investigating the nature of the universe. It just has to do with a total sort of passive, uh, you know,
Yeah, art heightens the senses, entertainment dulls them. Um, or you have a scenario like is portrayed in Fahrenheit 451, where there's an active, the authorities actively suppress art because they don't want it to have that effect. They go and they burn books because they don't want people to escape the world of dulled senses and titillating pleasures that's been set up to control them.
right. And I mean, in Shakespearean terms, one of the great examples, one of the examples that I was recently reading is King Lear. And I mean, King Lear is a very, very powerful drama. And the tragedy, I mean, in a sense, especially for people, in our culture where, I mean, we all have such a short attention span. I mean, King Lear is pretty good in that the essence of the tragedy unfolds right at the beginning, where King Lear is basically, he's basically going into retirement. He's like, I'm tired of dealing with all this, organizing my kingdom, the organization of the state. I'm just going to split my kingdom up to three, give it to my three daughters. They're going to get married, to the Duke of Albany, the Duke of Kent, and whatever. These people are just going to work it out. He doesn't. And so the way he goes about, though, distributing the kingdom is he brings in his three daughters and he says, tell me how much you love me, right? And he is going to give them give an allotment, a part of his kingdom, based on how well they can sort of praise their father
Flatter him.
and flatter him and make him feel good. And I mean, it's disgusting, number one, that somebody's really just making decisions based on how, how you make them feel. And that there's no higher sense of not only responsibility, but a higher sense of consequence. And what unfolds is just a storm of mayhem, right? Of between the one daughter, Cordelia, who's the most rational, she's short of words and she's not really that expressive. And so he is not convinced by her speech of her love for him. And he says, screw you. And he gives it to the other daughters and, their power hungry husbands, and they all fight. It becomes a total storm of chaos. And I mean,
Well, and it's also noteworthy and again completely intentional that the daughter who is the least effective flatterer is in fact the one who loves him most.
right,
It's not where there was one daughter whose flattery matched her love. No, what the ability to flatter and the actual feeling are inversely proportional to each other. And that's a given. That's a foundational given from which the action of the play unfolds.
right. And I mean, the reality is that King Lear not only finds himself in a storm of chaos and mayhem, he finds himself at a certain point in a literal storm because he's run off. And it's only when he runs into the peasant, right, and sees the absolute, crippling poverty that people are living in, that he has a flash of insight, and that he realizes you know, he's just so surprised at the level of poverty and the misery that people are living in. He says, I didn't realize that people live like this, right? And he's in a total mad,
And there's also the part of the fool who at one point Lear remarks, you're the only one who can tell me the truth, is the court jester.
right. Society has become so, I mean, this is a fun theme in Shakespeare, right? Society is so, there's no rectification of terms, right? It's the confusion of terms. Society is so confused, right? Everybody's axioms are so, there are so many fallacies in people's thinking that, the fool is the only one that really is actually making sense. And I mean, the point, the great tragedy is that Lear has this sort of clairvoyant moment as when he's in the midst of the storm, a storm that he's pretty much brought on himself because he's such a fool, right? He's such a fool, sort of a romantic, just sort of really goes by whatever he can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell. That it's total war, it's total collapse of civilization, and everybody suffers as a result because this guy who was in a position to actually make a decision was totally blinded by these totally infantile romantic sort of ideas about the world and his place in it. But I mean, this is not just a matter for kings. I mean, this is the tragedy of so many lives, right? Of so many people who fail to see the higher sort of lawfulness, which they're actually a part of. But because of their, whatever their proclivities or sort of axioms, they're unable to see this higher lawfulness that they could be acting on, that they should be acting on, that actually shapes things in the real world. And they're just living in this imaginary world like King Lear. So, I mean, high art, this is Shakespearean art. It's getting you to be conscious of the nature of tragedy, which is really a question of whether we understand the nature of human beings or not, whether we understand the nature of history or not. And there are consequences to that. But it's exciting, contrary to the brave new world, it's exciting that there are consequences, that we do all have a role to play in our society. And much of that depends on our ability to understand our own underlying axioms and the axioms governing our society and our ability to investigate whether they're valid or not, to really get at what universe are we in? What universe is this person that I'm talking to operating within? Is it valid or not? And I mean, right, as far as art goes, if you can't judge, the whole point of high art and having ideas to discuss is that you can discuss the validity of an idea. But I mean, the problem with modernism, postmodernism today, unlike Shakespearean art, high art, is that you can't really question the validity of an idea, right? They're people's feelings. This is how somebody feels. How dare you question how somebody feels? Okay, no, I can't question how somebody feels. But if that's all there is, if there's an idea, we should be able to judge it. But if there's no ideas, okay, nobody judges anything. All there is feeling. But this leaves us in a totally sort of empty place where there's no sense of direction. And
well, I'd like to explore that idea of consequences, and this ties in with what you were just saying.
Mhm.
An action is morally right or wrong in the universe because of its consequences, even if they're unintended, and that's what makes the action in a Shakespeare or a Greek tragedy so powerful. Is you explore what the consequences of the actions that the characters undertake are, and how that impacts the larger moral universe. In modernism, you don't get that. There's no exploration of consequences, again, because there's no value judgment. And again, because there's no, who are we to judge what the effect produced in one person is versus another? So there's completely no exploration of consequences, or if the consequences are presented, it's in a value neutral atmosphere where you just get, a news reporting, and each person can take away from it what they will. Again, the effect is different on each reader or audience member.
Right. And I mean, it becomes an argument for the Brave New World, really. And I mean, people probably don't like that. They probably don't, maybe they think that's extreme. But ultimately, maybe they're reasonable people. But the point is that if society loses a conception of natural law, right, of a higher lawfulness, which every individual has the intrinsic ability to investigate, and which becomes a means of fully developing their own potential, then we become hostage to emotion, right? To pure emotion, right? Emotion, we shouldn't say just emotion, it's emotion severed from reason, as opposed to the conception of beauty, which is in Schiller, which is the resolution of emotions and reason, is that it's where the form and the matter come together, right? Where the feeling that is produced and the idea underlying those feelings are connected. There's a relationship, and to the degree that there's a harmony between the felt and the unfelt, right? The idea governing the parts and the parts and the whole, there's a sense of harmony, of beauty. And if you don't have that, and you just have this sensuality, it ultimately it leaves us with nothing to really hang on to. And I think this shows the degree to which, a seemingly subjective question is art. I mean, if now art is really just subjective, you find that people ultimately, treat reality as subjective. Art is really a reflection of the universe we believe we're in. And to the degree that art is merely subjective, you find that people start treating reality as merely subjective, and their emotions as their arbitrary emotions as authority. And so what happens on the whole? What does this look like on the whole? Well, it means that really arbitrary authority wins. And ultimately, whoever controls opinion, whatever the popular opinion is, wins.
Well,
right?
and I could say we live in the brave new world. Um, the historian Will Durant said the Middle Ages were the closest approximation to Plato's Republic. With the clergy taking on the role of the guardians. You could equally say our own age is the closest approximation in the brave new world. Instead of soma, we have opiates.
Marijuana.
We have available promiscuity, and you could even argue instead of the mass reproduced multiplets or whatever you call them produced. We have cheap foreign labor treated the same way. Um,
Right.
that that's the, that's the world that's been constructed for us.
Right. And I mean, yeah, I mean it's a very stark reality, but I think it's important. And I mean, high art therefore gives us, thus the imperative for really investigating high art is that high art is really the alternative to a brave new world, as Huxley explicitly states.
Exactly.
That we, yes, there's truth ultimately makes all, I like to think that one truth can kill 1,000 lies, but 1,000 lies can't kill one truth. And so this whole idea that, okay, even if most people do live in a brave new world, the question is, what universe are you operating on, right? What universe do you live in? And that's really what's going to actually define the outcome of things, is those individuals who are able to conceptualize a higher truth, like a great tragedian would, like a great artist would. These are the people who are granted the opportunity of attaining a higher insight into the workings of their society, and therefore the insight into how that society can be changed, because they know what's fundamentally driving it at its most fundamental level, beyond the surface appearance of things. And so they find themselves in an ability, they find themselves in a Shakespearean universe, right? There are consequences, yes, there are tragedies, but the point is that we are conscious actors, and all the world's a stage, right? All the world's a stage for these are very powerful concepts. I mean, a lot of them have been sort of reduced to these, sort of cliches, but the point is that no, if you have a sense of a Shakespearean universe, you can become a conscious actor in the universe. And if you don't, right, you can choose to just live in that brave new world and take soma. But the reality is there is tragedy. And the reality is that if you're just choosing to live in that brave new world and take soma, even if your world doesn't have a concept of tragedy because it doesn't have good or bad, the reality is you are in a tragedy. And
And the story of Brave New World ends with a tragedy. That's really the irony behind it. Is it ends in a tragedy, and the the members of the society are just too dulled to recognize it.
yeah, yeah. So we need high art. And that's what we're passionate about. And I mean, I think a lot of the answers to a lot of seemingly impossible problems in society, a lot of the insights into how we can approach these problems are found in the greatest works of tragedy, in Aeschylus, in Shakespeare, in Dante, right? And all their heirs, right? All their poetic heirs, and even in other cultures as well, whether it's in Confucian China, right? And the classical Chinese poets, or even classical Chinese painting. There's such a wealth of, and that'll probably make for a good podcast in the future. But there's such a wealth of insight into the human soul, right? Into the nature of the inner life of human beings, just in these classical landscapes. That, yeah, high art is really a way that people can sort of it's a resource. It's a place that people can go if they really want to gain a greater insight into history, and if they want to become conscious actors, which is what I think we all should be. And I mean, that's why we love beautiful art. That's why we love classic art. That's why we still read it today. That's why it's still around for us to read.
And I think that's a good place to conclude today.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more to say, but I think, yeah, uh, we're this Brave New World is definitely a concept worth chewing over as it relates to a Shakespearean world, and let people sort of decide which world they want to live in. And we're going to keep talking about that next week.
Yes.
So thank you, Adam, for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And we'll be back.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. So talk to you soon.
Okay.
Take care.
You too.